gotta decide whether I punch Charlie in the face, and like, what the fuck do I do?
So welcome back. This is episode 2, part 2 of episode 1. Which nice, well described. So in this episode, we try to untangle the knot that we made for ourselves in the first episode. Basically, we both do a little bit of reflection on what went right, what went wrong. You're going to hear a couple pieces where I've just entirely cut out responses that I've given because they were incoherent, and so there may be a little bit of cuts that you'll notice, but just pretend like you haven't. And
it's mainly because I dazzled you so bad with my rhetoric.
Yeah,
you just
exactly.
Literally speechless.
Yeah, that's precisely. I was tongue-tied and mortified at how I didn't understand the first time. But actually, I do have like a serious realization moment. I think about 20 minutes in, 15 minutes in, and so I wish I had that earlier, but so it goes. So we finally returned to the subject of epistemic modesty, and I think make a bunch of progress. And then talk about politics and that kind of thing. And so, yeah, I don't know, Ben, thoughts on your side?
No, mostly just apologies for being so confusing during the first episode. But I think we try and make amends here and move on to some other subjects, which I think are of interest.
Climate change comes up at some point. All sorts.
Future generations come up at some point.
Oh, that's right. We started arguing about future generations. That's right. Fuck them.
We don't know shit to them.
Yeah,
what have they ever done for us?
Yeah, nothing. I have not once been served by any of the future generations, but yeah. So happy listening, and we'll see you on the other side. Yeah, so when you re-listen to our first conversation, where do you think we got stuck?
I think we were discussing the level of moral decision-making, or rather we're just discussing moral decision-making at slightly different levels. I think that was my main takeaway. So I think you were talking about what mechanism do we want in play which allows us to make as much moral progress as possible. And I was talking about the level at which today you have to go out and you have to make decisions. You have to make moral decisions about the world. And how do you go up weighing different perspectives on how to make that decision, right? Should you always just act? Should you always take the decision which seems best to you? Or should sometimes, if you know that like your perspective is actually a minority of all the moral perspectives out there, like if you know that majority of people who have the same expertise, have the same reasoning ability, differ with you on some conclusion, how much should you take that disagreement into account? Right. And so I don't think this actually has much to do with the mechanism. In fact, I think we would definitely agree on a mechanism. We want the mechanism not to just like furnish a rule that you can call upon in every situation, but rather you want some mechanism that allows you to continue having conversations and error correct but most importantly to just be able to always think through situations and always be able to actually like come to conclusions and keep making moral progress, right? And so I think we were talking just at different levels. I think you were talking about like over the long run, what's the best mentality to adopt when it comes to making moral progress, right? And that is one of criticism and talking about like the consequences of actions, because it allows you to import into the conversation it allows you to import an environment in which you can like have critical analysis of a moral framework as opposed to like some rule-based system, right? Whereas I was just like, I gotta go out and I gotta decide whether I punch Charlie in the face, and like what the fuck do I do? Like,
yeah, definitely. So, when I was re-listening to this episode, it reminded me of exchange between David Deutsch and Sam Harris, and so I want to actually play this clip for our listeners because I think it's a nice way to highlight the two levels which we got stuck on in the first conversation. And so to set this clip up a little bit, Sam wrote a book called The Moral Landscape, which is putting forth essentially a consequentialism-based system. He focuses on well-being of conscious creatures, and so he uses slightly different terminology. But for our purposes, we can think of it just as consequentialism. So he invites David Deutsch on, who has written a book called The Beginning of Infinity. He invited Deutsch on to give his thoughts about what his opinion was on Sam's book. And so I want to play this little clip because I think it highlights nicely these two different levels. And then I'll kind of come back and say what I mean. So here's the clip.
Interesting.
I feel like we haven't totally nailed what we might disagree about, because I'm just feeling an ocean of agreement.
Just as a last thing, let me just say that the overview of your book, I mean, I think your book achieves its purpose, and it is a very timely and important purpose. And if I have a criticism of the sort of fundamental logic of it, I can't even say that I'm sure that if it had been written to conform to what I'm about to say, it would have achieved its purpose better. So I don't know whether it would or not. But as a matter of truth, so I want to take the same attitude towards moral theories as Popper does towards scientific theories, and therefore regard all the theories about morality which claim to give it a foundation as being mistaken, but all of them have more or less value. Some of them much less, and some of them much more, regarded not as ideas about morality, but as critiques. So I think that, say, for example, so there are lots of different suggestions for the foundation, like, Kant's categorical imperative and utilitarianism and rules is fairness and the will of God, and human flourishing. So all those are proposals for foundations of morality. But if you regard them instead as critiques, then I think they're all quite valuable. And human flourishing could be interpreted as a sort of as an improvement on what went before, as a critique. So you can say, for example, with utilitarianism, they were able to say, if what we're supposed to do, what morality consists of, is going to church every Sunday, what purpose does this serve? And if it doesn't serve any purpose, it's up to the person who advocates it to make the case. It's prima facie critique of something that it doesn't have a purpose, and so therefore it puts the onus on the religious morality person to explain why, although usually if something doesn't have a purpose, we can reject it. In this case, we should not reject it. Then he could say, well, because God said so. And then there is the standard critique of religious-based anything, of how can we tell the difference between that claim and someone else's claim based on a different God or a different holy book or whatever. What criterion should we use? And if he says, well, the criterion is that our one is correct, then that is a bad explanation, because everyone else could use the same criterion. So it's a criterion that isn't a criterion. So I think human flourishing is a similar, but utilitarianism regarded as a fundamental theory is rubbish. Regarded as a critique of other theories, it's very powerful. And I think your thing is like utilitarianism, but it also has elements of some of the other, it also has elements of plain common sense, which is often forgotten by these theorists.
So I think Deutsch's rather cryptic remark at the beginning, where he says, I think that if your book was successful, and if you said what I'm about to say, it may actually be less successful. And then Deutsch continued to emphasize critiques and explanation. And so I submit that our talking past one another last time was due to these two levels, where one level is saying that progress is made via criticism and conjecture and explanation. But the other level was a level of consequentialism versus utilitarianism versus deontology versus Sam Harris's moral landscape. And the thought occurred to me that one can't just go around saying its explanations are the most important thing. One actually has to start coming up with explanations. And so Sam Harris, in this conversation, came up with an explanation. He came up with some proposal for moral progress, which is similar to consequentialism, but Sam doesn't tend to talk in that language. And so in that sense, these two views are perfectly congruent, but they are on different levels. One is explanations, and criticism is the fundamental driver of progress. But then you actually need to come up with explanations and come up with criticisms. And then I would submit that the most, let's say the explanation that I subscribe to the most would be consequentialism / Sam's well-being and consciousness-based moral system. So that's kind of how I understood. That's one part of my understanding of the failure of you and I to fully align last time, is that there's the one level of the mechanism and then the other level of the products of the mechanism. What do you think of this?
Yeah, I think that seems broadly right to me. I agree that there's these two different levels. There's like, you're talking about, the mechanism that actually drives social progress, and you eloquently last time were talking about why you think consequentialism or something close to that is the best driver of this progress. And then there's the level of like, you actually have to make decisions. And so I think epistemic modesty plays only a role in that second level where you actually have to make decisions. And as you say, like, Sam is putting forward like a specific moral theory. But the question behind driving epistemic modesty is one in which you are, or rather it asks to what extent you should have confidence in like a single moral theory. So at some point you have some amount of certainty that a specific moral theory is correct, but assuming that there are people who are like equally as smart as you somewhere on the planet who disagree, how reasonable is it to only adopt a single viewpoint on the issue?
Exactly. Okay. Awesome. Yeah. So then if we so we started last conversation with the subject of epistemic modesty. And then one example of epistemic modesty was consequentialism, and then we got stuck in the weeds on consequentialism. I feel satisfied that we can now move to the other part of like the main topic, which is epistemic modesty. I feel satisfied in the sense that I think we've resolved why we got stuck in the weeds in the consequentialism discussion. Moving to the epistemic modesty discussion, I think that there's still an extra fundamental difference in views that we need to sort out a little bit before we can go to the rest of the epistemic modesty subject, and that is the distinction between truth and certainty, or truth and belief, which we touched on a little bit last time. I think operating in the background of the epistemic modesty literature is an emphasis on beliefs and what is the best belief to have given the evidence. Coming up with the optimal rational belief seems to be the target, the goal of a lot of this writing, is what is the best belief to have. That is something that I'm less interested in than what is the truth of the matter, which is an objective, not subjective claim. And so I think part of our getting stuck last time is that you were interested in what is the best rational belief to hold, and I was interested, or we were talking about separate things slightly. And I was interested in is like what is true in a given situation,
Right.
and so that is kind of a implicit assumption of the epistemic modesty, which is that the goal isn't necessarily to discuss what's true or find what's true. The goal is to come up with the most rational belief to hold.
Right.
And so I guess the thing I want to say is that I find that to be the wrong target. I don't really care entirely what beliefs one should hold. And I think that the emphasis on beliefs is a consequence of Bayesian philosophy, which focuses on beliefs. And so when we were talking about this subjective, when we were talking about subjecting ideas into this arena, that we kind of started recognizing that there's two separate subjects at hand. And so I just wanted to highlight that distinction, which is I was maybe not talking about belief when I should have been, and not recognizing that that's the goal of epistemic modesty. But I want to put this to you to see if I understood this correctly. Is that the goal? Is epistemic modesty all about like what is the best belief to have? Or is it about what is the best truth? Or how do we get to truth? Badly phrased, but that's kind of the second subject I wanted to get onto the table somehow and see what your thoughts are on that.
I think you basically put your finger on it. I think it's trying to take stock of all available evidence and taking like an outside view of the situation, so not privileging your own view or your own intuition simply because they belong to you, but trying to take stock of what everyone believes, all the information given in the current state of the system, and trying to come up with the best representation of your, I guess your belief, but about what is true. So I think you can have, you're trying to model some truth about the world, and you're trying to come to the most rational belief that informs your view of the truth.
Mm-hmm. And so something about that just seems like it's focusing on the wrong mark. Like,
okay,
so
let's
this. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, okay, let's maybe make it like concrete or something. So, let's say, so there's a okay, so we're in the middle of this coronavirus epidemic thing. I don't know if this has hit Canada much yet, but it's like a decently big deal in the Bay Area at the moment. And so, as an individual who has to like go about your day and be in contact with people and make decisions about like, do I go to work, do I go to the gym, these kind of things, you have to form some sort of opinion about how big of a threat this is and how likely you are to get sick, and if you were to get sick, how likely you are to die or some dire consequence like this, right? And so one way to go about this is to just, look at your own intuitions, examine your gut instinct and be like, I don't get the flu that often. Fuck it, I'm going out into public. I don't care. Another option is to try and gather as much evidence from various epidemiologists and try and come up with some reasonable representation, or reasonable synthesis of what experts actually think who like study this topic, right? And that might lead you to some belief in the situation that looks something like, most experts have an 80% confidence interval that this will affect like 20 to 50% of people on the planet or something like this. And therefore, my best expected action given this belief looks something like this. Right. And so I think that's the goal of epistemic modesty, is to try and cast away like some of your personal intuitions and try and gather expert opinion, whatever expert happens to mean in whatever situation you're in, and then so that you can act most reasonably in that situation. So that clarifies things tremendously. I love that example, and I think I see where part of the flaw in my own thinking was. So I was thinking about this focus on belief as being the wrong target because I was juxtaposing it against a focus on truth and a focus on, say, the production of knowledge and
how do we learn, create objective knowledge? But this example has highlighted that I should not think of it as belief versus truth. I should think of it as belief in service of decision making. And belief is of vital importance when the goal is to make optimal decisions. And that didn't click in my head until this very moment, which is that it's really important to try to come up with the optimal, say, beliefs in the presence of uncertainty, because we are agents that need to make decisions that interact in the world, and all we ever have is imperfect information, and so all we can ever do is try to make decisions given this imperfect information, and that's I think that contextualizes and frames the conversation of epistemic modesty in its rightful place. And I think I had taken too strong of an opinion against it because I was juxtaposing it against say knowledge production. Would you say that's a fair
that seems
understanding?
Like a perfect distillation of what we've been talking about. Yeah, I like that.
Awesome. That is, I would say that completely clears up everything, at least on my side.
Nice. Yeah, good.
Yeah. That makes it really clear in my head. So now that we've resolved that, I think that we're good to maybe go into the epistemic modesty subject, perhaps with fresh opinions. Yeah. So, how do you use this information, this discussion, to inform your choices in daily life?
I think basically I think the broad lesson is to just dampen your confidence in many of your opinions, basically, and sort of make you less resolute to come to conclusions as quickly as you might otherwise. I think that's basically the primary function, because at the end of the day, basically what it's saying is like, you probably don't know as much as you think you do, and there's a lot of people out there who are just as rational who think otherwise, and therefore it's kind of irrational for you from an outside perspective to like to hold some belief like as strongly as you do, and so you should probably like tone down your certainty that certain things are as they are. And so I think in the political realm this does a lot, right? Because there's like there's obviously not well-intentioned people, but oftentimes there's a lot of well-intentioned people on both sides of the aisle arguing like for or against certain policies, right? And often the evidence is like very confusing, right? And I think we just tend to like sort of line up along party lines or something when it comes to various policies or anything like this. And so I think this just kind of forces you to take a step back and sort of just dampen your own confidence a bit.
You use the phrase inside and outside view often, and I'm curious if you could explain what you mean by that slightly.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, that's
I'm familiar with it in the sense of like Danny Kahneman and stuff, but I don't know if there's extra meaning behind that phrase when you use it. So
yeah, so that's precisely actually the way in which I'm using it. So the insider view of a situation is the view that you would take as like a subjective agent looking at the situation and how it affects you. So for example, the best way to do this is with examples, I think. So if we're going to look at how long, if I decide to write a book, say, I'm going to try and forecast how long it's going to take me to write a book, right? It's a natural thing to do. And so how I might try and make this decision from an inside view is to say, well, like I'm a pretty good writer, or in my case, like not a very good writer, but I have like this strong idea and I have a lot of family support and I have a lot of time to put into it. So I can do it like probably much quicker than the average, right? Like I got confidence in my abilities, and so I'm going to say I can do it like in half the average time that the person takes to write, the average person takes to write a book. And the outside view would say you're sort of just privileging insider information you have, and what you should actually do is kind of take a step back and just look at the average amount of time it takes to write a book. And that's probably a better estimate of how long it will actually take you to write a book, because it's hard for you to know if you actually deviate from the average a lot, and you should basically just take into account people who are in your reference class when it comes to this decision, and then you should think that you're going to perform basically as those as those people who are in your reference class. And so it's hard to decide what your reference class of people is in many situations, right? In the book writing example, is it everyone who's writing a book? Is it like everyone who's writing a nonfiction book? Say, if I was going to write a nonfiction book, is it like all males who are writing a nonfiction book? So it's hard to define maybe what that reference class is. But the difference between the inside and outside view is just whether you adopt your own sort of personal viewpoint and project that onto the situation, as opposed to just looking at it sort of from just as an outsider would, basically.
Yeah. I've heard it also described in the context of, say, like estimating the price of a home renovation, where you can carefully calculate the price of doing your kitchen, doing your bedroom, painting the walls, etc. Or you can instead look at the class of similar home renovations from friends and family and neighbors that have done something similar, and just see what they paid.
Right.
In that sense, it's almost better to abstract away from all the micro details, because you can never know if the contract job is going to go long or go short or whatever, and it's better to just consider the class of all similar projects and see roughly what they paid. But I've always heard of the outside view, inside view framework as essentially saying you should always take an outside view. Is my understanding correct? Or are there times when it's better to take an inside view?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think this is like resolved to any extent, but I think you should. I think my initial intuition on this would be that you should be taking the inside view precisely when you're holding some information that puts you in your own reference class. So you're holding information which basically means that you have better information than anyone else.
Interesting.
And but then if you're properly defining your reference class, then you're in your own you're the only person in your own reference class, right? So I think basically the answer is no. Because if you were in a position where you're actually going to make a much better decision than anyone else, then that just puts you sort of by definition in a reference class of your own, because you must be holding some information that no one else has. Yeah.
Or perhaps you can kind of, if you think for some reason that the information you have is particularly accurate, then perhaps you want to not seek out other reference class. Seek out the correct reference class. But if you feel like you have imperfect information and you don't have a strong inside view, then that may be the time to default to the outside view, to default to the class of all similar home renovations, etc. But I guess the problem is that people by default always want to take the inside view, right? Which is why Danny Kahneman's insight is so valuable, is because the natural thing for us to do, the thing that we do kind of by definition, or not by definition, excuse me, but we default to, that's a better way to phrase it, is to take the inside view. Exactly. And so to make it slightly more political, say, the insider view, outside view thing when applied to climate change has been something that I've been thinking about, in the sense that no one can possibly read all of the micro details of the IPCC report, but you can consider the outcomes of previous climate catastrophes, such as acid rain and overpopulation, and see that although they were a problem, they were a solvable problem, and it was solved partially because people took it seriously, but the predictions at the time didn't match the outcome. But in the same way that people are freaking out about the coronavirus, and it's a very active freaking out about it, which will cause people to become more cautious,
right?
And then prevent it from becoming a huge problem. This kind of allows me to think through what the likely outcome of the climate change discussion is going to be in 50, 60 years, by considering similar discussions that people have had going back to like Thomas Malthus and stuff. So maybe this starts moving the subject slightly to the political realm, about how do we apply the various concepts of epistemic modesty to reasoning through difficult political discussions, which are intrinsically tribal and which we rarely can have perfect information.
Yeah. Just
what are
on
your
that.
thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, I'd just be curious. Like, can you summon to mind an example of something where you disagree with most of your peers about it, but you're pretty certain that you're right? Is there an example of this in the political realm?
In political,
I guess
in the political realm specifically,
in anything, really,
or no?
but it might be more interesting if it's political.
Yeah. So I can come up with a number of examples. So the free will discussion is one. I would say most people by default think that we have free will, and I've been convinced, as you have, that we don't.
Right.
But that is one which one constantly finds opposition to, because it is such an innate feeling that we all have.
Yeah.
Another one, actually, I would say climate change. In the sense that I am an optimist when it comes to climate change, that it's obviously real, but human beings over the span of our existence have done nothing but fight against a hostile climate. And one could rightly consider all of human history as being nothing but taking hostile, dangerous climates and making them hospitable, in the sense that I would be dead in 15 minutes in Calgary, Alberta, where I grew up, had it not been for technology and innovation. And so in that sense, I think that climate change is a problem, but it's a problem which human beings are uniquely capable of dealing with, because all of civilization has been nothing but taking dangerous climates and making them safe. And so in that sense, so that's another example of opinion that I hold, which most of the people around me don't hold. I could keep going. Religion is another one, in the sense that I work with a lot of people up at UBC who are actually quite religious. The religiousness and science doesn't necessarily have a problem coexisting, and so that's another example. What about yourself? Any examples come to mind?
Yeah, probably. Yeah, I feel like one, maybe just like valuing future generations a lot. So like not thinking that there's any particular reason to privilege our moral concern on those who live right now, but thinking like those who live in the future sort of deserve our moral consideration just as much, and probably actually most of our moral value actually lies in the future, just given how many more people will come to exist in the future than like are alive right now. And so this probably moves me closer to being worried about existential risk more than the average person. So I see it as like not just dangerous insofar as it threatens the lives of all those alive right now, but I think the biggest problem with it is that it would just like snuff out the billions, perhaps trillions of lives who would like come after us. And that puts me like pretty far out there in some circles when it comes to moral thinking, and also just the classic like vegetarianism, veganism thing like that still gets you in trouble with some people. And
So I totally with the vegetarian veganism thing, that's one of these questions which like I am completely on the side of the vegetarians and the vegans. I just don't have the moral character to act on it. So one way I've tried to kind of assuage my guilt is by donating monthly to the I think it's called the Better Food Institute, which is putting a lot of
or the Good Food Institute or
research.
something.
Excuse me, the Good Food Institute. Yeah, the Good Food Institute. And so I think that there's like a collective action thing happening where once everybody moves to like Beyond Meat alternatives, then it'll be a lot easier for the remaining people to become vegetarian. Right. But before that happens, it's really tough to do it myself, and so I get around it by donating. But so I give this as an example of something which I don't think I have the moral character to change, but I know that all the right arguments all the persuasive arguments are on the side of the
right. Interesting. Yeah.
The vegetarians. But on the weighing future populations question, we may have an interesting difference of views here. Can you say more about that? How much do you weigh future populations? Do you weigh them more than ourselves, our current populations?
No, it's just precisely that I would think. So let's So there's a couple things to differentiate here, but I think if you know someone's going to exist in the future, so reduce any of the uncertainty around you having know they're going to exist. I don't think there's any reason to discount their welfare. So I think like a person who's living in the future counts morally just as much as anyone living right now, right? They're like their suffering's going to be equal to any suffering happening right now. They're going to be a human in the future. I don't see a way to discount that without drawing some arbitrary moral line. And then once you start drawing arbitrary moral lines, it starts becoming very difficult to criticize things like racism and sexism and stuff, because those are also just arbitrary lines, right? And so, yeah, given if you're certain that someone's going to exist in the future, I don't think there's any reason for discounting them morally. And then you just start running the calculus of like, well, on expectation, how many people are there going to be around in the future? Probably more than are alive right now. And so where does most of our moral value lie? Probably in the future. Even if humans just lived for the average length that species on Earth live. And there's reasons to think we might live longer than that, right? If we sort of like take our destiny into our own hands. But even if we are around only as long as like the average species are, that's still like billions and trillions of lives in the future. We're like still quite early on in that stage. So there's many more people who will live in the future than are alive or who have even lived in the past.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess I take a bit of a historical view on this, which is so much of, let's say, 20th century suffering has come from utopian visions of paradises for people in the future. And it's the weighing of the infinite happiness against the finite amount of current everyday suffering, which allows people to shove other people into gulags and concentration camps. And so I'm actually quite worried about the equating of the infinite future against the present suffering now, because people in the future will also have an infinite number of people in the future. And so I see this as an argument which can be twisted to justify any amount of cruelty right now. And it's not an arbitrary line. It's more just a property of infinity, which is that if we're talking about the future, unless you're going to draw an arbitrary endpoint to it, which obviously one can't, then we're talking about weighing the suffering of people here and now against an infinite amount of pleasure, which is a justification, I think, for not doing anything about the suffering here and now. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things going on here. I think you're confused on a variety of levels, young man.
Oh, excellent. Yeah. Oh, please correct me. Yeah, that's great.
No, let's just say like a very large number of people in the future. The infinite ethics is actually very tricky because like precisely you're trying to do like expected value calculations with infinites. Like things kind of break down. So let's just like say like a very large number, because I mean the universe is only finite, so like infinite probably doesn't make sense. But anyway, but I think the trade-off that you're talking about isn't necessarily wrong. So I think like the specific ones you mentioned of like gulags and sort of attempts that have been done before to reach utopia are wrong for reasons I'll discuss. But if you were to actually know that some sacrifice now would lead to like much more happiness for way more people in the future, I do think in principle that's probably the right thing to do. That contrasts with all of our moral intuitions, and you know, like most things we sort of think are just like right and just right now. But I think if you're going to take like a consequentialist calculus to morality, that's like hard to argue with, right? If the amount is in the future is actually going to outweigh.
So this is conditioned on perfect knowledge.
Exactly.
So if I know that let's say not having a glass of water is going to create 50,000 pounds of happiness in the future, then obviously not having the glass of water is the right thing to do. But we have to talk not under the condition of perfect knowledge, but in the condition of what we actually have. Right?
Exactly.
So using the perfect knowledge as like the ideal case from which we draw approximations, I don't think is necessarily the right thing to do, because we never have that, and so it's not the right way to think about it. But let me take that back slightly. Let me say that when you have fairly good knowledge that doing action X will cause future suffering to be alleviated, then you want to take action X. Yes, I don't want to ignore that. But what do you do in the messier cases, I guess, when you don't have perfect knowledge?
Right.
And do that?
And then it just becomes very hard, and it's so. For example, in the case of like communism and gulags, it's so uncertain that you're going to come to anything better, right? That the risk of things not going well like far outweighs actually taking the action, right? So like one, you're definitely going to harm a lot of people right now. Two, it's like incredibly uncertain that you're not going to harm people later. It's just like when you sit down and actually like do the calculus, I don't think it like comes out net positive. And so in real life, how this kind of starts affecting your decision making is to just start looking at things from a slightly longer term perspective, right? So you start like climate change looks a little bit more serious under these lights, right? Just because of like the small chances that it could influence far out generations much more, and also certain things start looking quite good, like making sure institutions are quite strong and have the ability to like make really good decisions, ensuring that moral progress like keeps being made, ensuring that we keep our option value open, because people in the future probably will be more like morally sophisticated than we are, just given.
Sorry, when you say option value, I don't know what you mean by that.
Yeah, so like you could imagine, like several like possible futures for humanity. And there are, if we like take certain of these tracks, it might close off certain options in the future, right? Like, if you, what's a good example of this? Like,
so in the abstract, if you do action X, that will create 10 options in the future, but if you do action Y, that'll create 4 options, and so it's better to do action X. Is that
it could be like it's like a commitment problem, sort of. If you like commit yourself to certain actions, this reduces your option value in the future, right? And if we think we're only going to get better at like making moral decisions and sort of smarter in the future, we might want to like maintain option value.
I see.
And
that's
so
a nice way to phrase it.
so it looks at so just like different decisions start looking slightly better, and actually like radical change that you're very uncertain about, I think looks pretty bad actually under these like long-termist lights, because you're very unsure of the consequences. And so if this does pigeonhole you in some sort of like drastically bad scenario where humans are just going to live in like some very subpar state for a long time, this now influences like not only the current generation in very negative ways, but also has like terrible effects for the foreseeable, for like many future generations, which is bad.
It's interesting. I'm trying to think of a decision which I would make one way without thinking about what's the preferred term, like future happiness and suffering, or is there? I don't know if there's a term of art for referring to future calculations, but like in some sense, this is just consequentialism recast, isn't it?
Yeah, totally.
So it's just a different variant of consequentialism. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would say, yeah. The way I like to think about it actually is, so Peter Singer is like an influential Australian philosopher, has this nice concept of like an expanding moral circle. So over time, we've come to care and give moral patienthood to those not only who are like family and friends, but also to like our countrymen and women, and then past that, people like all over the planet, and then now it's like extending to animals and all this. So the people who we are morally concerned about, this group of people has been expanding over time. So this is like how we can see the moral circle expansion. And traditionally, I think this has been thought of in terms of so it's like impartiality. Your circle of impartiality, those two extend, impartiality to has been expanding. And I think long-termism, all it's doing is it's taking the spatial realm of impartiality and extending it to the temporal realm. So before we cared about people, so now we say we like, oh, there's no reason to care less about someone living in Africa than there is to care about someone, a fellow Canadian, for example, right? And actually, like 200 years ago, that would not have been obvious at all. Now it's like quite morally obvious to us, right? There's no intrinsic reason to care less about the person from Africa. And so this is just extending that to the time realm and saying like, there's no reason to care less about people who are going to be living in the future. And in fact, we should be pretty concerned about them because they're a pretty unrepresented group in our decision-making process, right? They have like no veto power. There's no representatives of people in the future sitting in parliament saying like, wait, it's not good for us. Like, don't pollute things now, even though it brings about good, I don't know, economic consequences A, B, and C. This is going to like really harm us in the future or something.
This is really fascinating because I in my head I'm going back between like thinking this is just a type of consequentialism, which I completely agree with, to the other side, which is like, this can justify present day suffering. So to use a climate change example, one thing that has been said is that by trying to get rid of fossil fuel usage right now, we have the immediate effect of making it more difficult for developing countries to get access to fossil fuels, hence keeping their development rate low by justification of saying that, well, in the future, it's going to be way worse for them now. So we want to get rid of all fossil fuels now because, that's going to have some really difficult consequences for, say, people in Nigeria and people in Botswana, but it's all worth it because 100 years from now, the climate's going to be 2 degrees cooler. And so one could go both ways with this kind of argument, I guess, or at least that's my impression at this moment. But do you not think that it could be used to justify present day suffering? Maybe that's the heart of my concern is, could this argument be used to justify present day suffering?
Well, okay, it could if you're like relatively sure that present day suffering is going to pay off in terms of like future happiness. But those bets are typically not very certain, right? So in your example of like using all the oil reserves there, I think you'd have to sit down and do like a relatively sophisticated calculation about like, hey, how certain are we of this? Like yada, yada, yada. And that's like quite complicated to do, right?
Okay.
I guess it could in principle. It rarely is because we're so unsure about how actions are going to affect the future. But to maybe even like play into your hand a bit, there is a problem when you're thinking about ethics in this way, and this is known as like the meat eater problem. Okay, so if you are pretty concerned about animal welfare and you do believe that animals like have the ability to suffer and that like factory farming is a bad thing, then it might actually look relatively bad to bring someone out of poverty who's going to go on to live a lifestyle where they're like consuming lots of meat. Right, because they go on, they contribute to the economy, and they like afford a lot of meat. And like over the course of their life, they might actually do like net negative. They might bring about net negative welfare. Like their welfare will be positive, but like the cumulative amount of suffering that is being inflicted onto animals might be negative. So you do get into these kinds of problems with this sort of ethical thinking, right? But I think you get into these problems with consequentialism anyway. And like you said, I do think this is just like a very natural, if unintuitive extension of consequentialism. And we should like be thinking really hard about this. And just because we do run into like moral difficulty doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing our best to actually figure out like what the best answer is.
Would it be a fair summary to say that it's essentially consequentialism plus inclusion of future generations? I liked your the way that you phrased it, how it's Peter Singer just basically says, take the spatial dimension and include the temporal dimension as well in your analysis. And is there anything more than that to this argument, or is it basically just make sure that when you're considering the consequences, you include future generations? It's not saying that one must include future generations more than present generations. It's just saying that one should include that as well. Is that fair?
That's all it is, yeah. And I think I think it's
agree.
actually less, like, I think if you were to actually just look at consequentialism in the abstract, this would actually be implied. I think it's just human intuition that's driving us to only care for, like, people who are alive right now. And I actually think this will probably be, my bet is that, like, in 100, 200 years, we'll look back upon, like, how we've reasoned morally and think it was a pretty big gap in our reasoning that we've ignored people who, like...
So that's interesting. Yeah. So I let me say I'm totally on board with that, which is just include the future as well. But I guess I don't necessarily think that human beings don't do that or haven't done that throughout history, which I don't know if that's what you're implying, but for example, the founding fathers who made the Constitution of the United States, the whole point of that is because of the consideration of future generations. Any institution at all that is meant to be permanent is considering the future generations' use of that institution. So what am I missing? So you seem to be saying that human beings don't do this, and they should. But I guess I push back slightly and say that I think human beings do this, and they should continue to.
Yeah, I think you're just, like, cherry picking good examples. Basically, I think perhaps, on average we, like, don't, me included, like, don't go around my day thinking about, like, how this is going to impact future generations. And I think even institutions, I think mostly institutions are set up for the current day political cycle. I think this is quite obvious if you look at, like, how elections work, right? We, like, vote on a party every 4 years, and I'm not saying we should vote, like, less often, but it's, like, quite clear that our politics and our demands are, like, geared towards, like, the next 4-year term cycle or something, right? And, like, actions are put in place that will guarantee re-election in, like, 4 years. And they, you know, if you say, like, well, yeah, the policy is gonna, like, it's gonna hurt the economy, you know, for, like, the next 4 years, but after that it'll look really good by all these estimates and stuff, like, people would not be happy with that. And so I think in general, like, yes, governments are set up sort of by definition to, like, look after people in the coming generations, but I think they actually factor into our moral calculus much less than they should.
Well, so there's also maybe a distinction to be made between the kind of moral decisions one makes every day, which you're right, I tend not to think about future generations when I'm making decisions about which book to read next or what have you. Distinction between, let's say, the everyday moral decisions and more governmental, institutional, societal, long-term voting decisions, which people, I would argue, do tend to think about future generations quite often. The current election cycle focuses on climate change issues. It focuses on, let me not say the current election cycle. Let me just say that every election cycle over the last 10 years, climate change, gun control, abortion, gay marriage, like, these implicitly carry the weight of future generations, and the things that people tend to become, say, tribal and polarized around are precisely those big political conversations which have important consequences for the future, right? So the cherry picking examples thing is perhaps fair, but would you accept a replacement, which is more just there's the political decision making and then there's the daily life decision making, and what you're saying is we need to consider the future generations much more in our daily life decisions? Or do you want to?
Okay. So I guess I was, like, wasn't super fair of me to say you're cherry picking.
Oh no! It's cherry picking. It's totally fair to say. Yeah, 100%. No, but I guess I want to substantiate it slightly, which is to say that most political debates, I would say, focus on the impacts of these policies in the future. So the cherry picking, like, obviously every example is cherry picked in some sense, but to try to get more to the underlying principle of the thing, I would say that the substantial debates that people have are and become polarized around are precisely those debates which are important for generations to come. Perhaps we disagree, or perhaps we see it slightly differently. But I would just contrast that against the kind of everyday decisions which people make, which perhaps don't consider the future generations at all. And maybe that's what you're saying.
Yeah, so okay, there's definitely a distinction to be made here between like political decision making and personal decision making, and like definitely on a personal level, how often do we think about like the absolute consequences of our actions, even disregarding future generations, but just like how rarely we are like considering Africa in our decision making process. Yeah. This is like pretty rare, obviously. Yeah. And probably for good reason, right? You might just be paralyzed and not be able to do anything if you're like always concerned about the exact effect that your action's going to have. So fair point taken on that front. I think I just have a different opinion than you maybe on like how much political decisions, political institutions are actually concerned about their effect on like the far run future. It seems like mostly people concerned about like their generation and perhaps their children. But I think
okay, fair point. So sorry to cut you off, but just interesting distinction. So maybe what I'm arguing is that the current decisions are like 1 or 2 generations ahead, and you're saying no, man, you got to go like 500 years, 1,000 years ahead, and perhaps that's another distinction which is worth highlighting.
Yeah, I think it's less about like picking a point in time at which to go ahead, but it's more about like considering the aggregate of like how many possible people could live in the future, and like this is a big number of people. And so I think our decisions like rarely consider the extent to which there's a far greater number of people in the future than there are like alive today. So I'll give you like a concrete example of this is that like in, I think it was 2018, the fella who 2017, the fellow who won the Nobel Prize in Economics, so I'm blanking on his name, he won it for like some models of climate change, basically. Mm-hmm. And snuck into his like analysis there is this discount rate on like how much future welfare should be discounted in relative to like current welfare. And this is a very natural thing to do in economics, not purely because of like moral discounting, but there's also just uncertainty element, right? So like it is better to have $1 today than probably $2 a year from now, because you can like put the dollar away in a bank and accrue interest, and like there's uncertainty with respect to like how much value the $2 is going to carry in the future. So there's like good economic mathematical reasons to discount the future like on paper. But that being said, in his analysis, future generations were discounted to such an extent that people like, I think 500 years from now, we're at like 0.001 the weight of someone now. So suffering on them was like, accounted for at that low of a rate compared to suffering now. And that just seems like very wrong.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, for sure.
And so these are the kind of decisions that are like, these are being snuck into our models. These are like our background assumptions, right? Like this is what's like going on, like when we talk about like political consequences of things. And I feel like this is just not
I love this. So it's fantastic. It's fantastic in the sense that I forget that you are working in an economics lab. Lab, is that the right term? I don't know.
Something, yeah.
You're working in economics, say, and so these political/philosophical discussions actually really matter when you're coming up with models which people then make decisions on. And so I thought that was a fantastic example, because when I had heard the phrase discount rate in our previous conversation, I had thought this is entirely hypothetical. But I'm now realizing that this is not hypothetical at all, because people make these models of the, say, climate change. And they actually have to include a discount rate. Yeah. And so just concretizing it for me was really valuable, because I didn't appreciate that this philosophy, this view, will literally determine the scalar values you decide to plug into particular models of the future.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's really valuable. So I want to ask another question about how this impacts your thinking on around questions of existential risk, because the existential risk conversation is one that I I guess I haven't fully formed my opinions on it yet. Well, never fully form any opinions, but my opinions aren't even close to formed. And so I guess I would love to hear a little bit about how you use these ideas to think through questions of existential risk.
Yeah. So I should also say at the outset that I'm not fully sure of like my personal opinions on these questions either, partially because like some of the conclusions are so unintuitive, and partially just because it does take so much time to like work through the arguments by yourself and like become on board with some of the conclusions that you might reach. And so a lot of my opinions here are actually formed from what I think is like taking sort of an outside view on people like who think about these questions pretty seriously and looking at like, okay, so what if sort of like average answers do these people come up with, and sort of like just letting my morals be informed by that for the time being. But I think what this does in general is just make you much more concerned about existential risk. And also, so yeah, two things. One, it just makes you more concerned because not only would existential risk, so an existential catastrophe, which would, let's say, like wipe out the human race, would be super bad. One, because it would just like kill you and all those people you love, and it would like snuff out all that happiness. But two, it would also snuff out like all possible human life in the future, and which, if you're taking like a sort of a long-termist perspective on this, is a lot of lives, right? An expectation, and so this is like a lot of happiness that's snuffed out, and so it looks like sort of just extra bad. Existential risk looks like extra bad, sort of under this moral framework,
because it's not just about the suffering of people undergoing extinction, but it's all about the absence of pleasure of those in the future.
Yeah, exactly. It's like looking at the counterfactual. If that hadn't happened, there'd been a lot more happiness and good lives lived in the future, especially when we consider like the upward trend of human welfare and the progress we're making over time, right? And so this would just like snuff out a lot of happiness, which would be bad. But it also does some interesting counterintuitive things to your thinking insofar as like the percentages of people that might be killed in big catastrophes is concerned. So now, I think if you ask like most people, you know, is killing 99% of the population, if like 99% of the population died, is that like almost as bad as 100% of the population dying, or closer to like 0% of the population dying? And I think most people's answer would be like, well, it's closer to 100% of the population dying. Like this seems like almost as bad. It's 99% of the population, right? But if you're sort of taking this longer range perspective, I think 99% of the population dying is actually much closer on the spectrum of badness to 0% of people dying than 100% of people. Because if it's the 1% of people who would survive in the difference between the 99 and 100% case would still be able to like propagate humans forward, and in like on the long range, on the long time scale, that'd probably only look like a minor dip, and then like and then we'd start carrying on again, and then like futures from now or generations from now, we might be at like a similar place. So it does like interesting things to your thinking on that front.
So that's where I start to get uncomfortable with it, frankly. So would you say that killing 99% is closer to 0% than 100%, but is 99% worse than 98%? Or like
is 99%? Yeah.
Okay, so it's still more as bad, but
conditioned on like everything else being equal. Sure, like of course, like I guess, more death is bad, like obviously. But
I guess I'm just worried about playing games with infinity or large numbers, because you can front load the future value as much as you fucking want to downweight the current suffering.
But even just assume that humans just live as long as the average species on Earth, right? Yeah, I think this logic still plays out.
Yeah, but you have to basically go to the end of the big crunch of the universe or whatever, right? Unless you are willing to propose some other stopping point of human beings, if you're going to include every human being who could ever potentially live in the future.
Well, no, right? Just say like, okay, just assume like humans never take to the stars, right? And we just like on Earth, and humanity just survives as long as, or the potential number of humans in the future is
until the sun explodes.
Until like the average length of a species on Earth would survive like I don't know, a couple million years or something. That would be like the average length, right? And so just assume humans live for that many generations. then
yeah,
this
but
logic,
any of these assumptions like make me uncomfortable. It seems like any end point is going to be so laden with assumptions as to make it essentially meaningless. Assume the human beings live as long as the average species. Well, human beings are far from average if you're considering species. Well, okay, or assume that human beings outlive species but don't make it off the planet. Then why make that assumption? Or assume that human beings do make it off the planet but don't make it out of the solar system. Then you can it seems that there is no reasonable assumption that everyone can agree on that will allow us to share the same numbers here. And so if it's just consequentialism plus future concern, yes. If it's
or just real consequentialism,
then I'm totally on board. But there's something just that seems like it's the wrong way to think about these problems if it's just trying to reduce it to a numerical calculation. A numerical calculation where we have essentially an infinite pool of future people to include into our calculation, however and whenever we want. I'm still trying to figure out how I feel about all this, but this concern doesn't bother you, I guess, right? This isn't something that you worry about. The kind of the slippery nature of thinking about moral problems this way. And if it doesn't bother you, maybe what am I missing?
No, I mean, I don't think so. I think it's basically just like an expected value calculation. Like, I think there's we can expect that there's probably a massive number of people in the future. And also there's this weird catch-22, right? Where it's okay, if you either sort of acknowledge that there could be a lot of people in the future, right? And then you take this more long-termist perspective, or you think humanity's gonna perish pretty soon. And then it's okay, what does it matter? If you think we're gonna die soon anyway, okay, great.
Let's ask a different question, which is, how do we apply this thinking to economic growth?
Yeah, okay, so I think the reason this is a good topic is because people are pretty divided on this question. So the most mainstream, this long-termist view of ethics has been, rather, who has made this view the most mainstream is the economist Tyler Cowen, who's pretty well known, I think.
Yeah.
And he wrote this book called Stubborn Attachments, which basically argues that economic growth is the most important driver of moral progress we have. One, because we shouldn't be discounting people in the future, and economic gains are cumulative, and so there's a massive difference between 2% growth and 3% growth yearly for 50 years, right? That's going to look like the difference between sort of U.S. and Mexico after a while. And so basically the best thing we could do, and the biggest poverty alleviation strategy, the best poverty alleviation strategy that we have to date is basically making countries richer, and so that people rise out of poverty. And so by these lights, the best thing to do is to basically ensure continued economic progress, with the caveat that it has to be economic progress that is sustainable. So
that it continues. So
exactly.
So that's great. So that makes a lot of sense to me. But I suspect that you want to criticize that. So I can play the role of somebody who defends that view because it sounds close to right.
No, I think actually, no, not really. I think I'm largely persuaded by this view. I think this is on average, this is pretty good, especially thrown in with the caveat that it needs to be sustainable economic progress.
Sorry, so did I not hear you say that Tyler Cowen doesn't include futures, or does he?
No,
does
sorry,
include
he does.
Futures?
He does. So
he does. Okay,
yeah,
okay. I misunderstood.
Yeah, I feel like that was a very bad explanation on my part. So
no. It sounds good. So basically, you're saying that when you apply this thinking to economic growth, it is a justification for sustained growth, precisely because it will ensure the happiness of future generations in a kind of a exponential and long-term way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so do you want to keep going on that, or
yeah, sure. Like, part of me is like, hell's yeah, this sounds great, right? Like, and this is basically the best poverty alleviation strategy we know of, right? And this kind of takes everyone's bucket, right? This takes like the conservatives bucket. There's like, yeah, economic growth, this is fucking awesome. And then the liberals bucket is like, yeah, I mean, this is good because countries are then able to empower themselves, and we don't have to go in and be like the white saviors and go in there and like give them money. They can just like, they can develop their own economies and things like this. And anyway, this looks good by a lot of people's lights, and it's like basically a proven effective strategy, proven just based on like historical data, like how much better we're doing now. And so this looks pretty good. So part of me is like, yeah, this is great. The other part of me is like, well, it's sort of unclear what sort of consequences like increasing rates of technological progress have, and especially when it comes to things like biorisk or AI risk or things like this, right? So those are like kind of unknowns that are scary to some extent, right? So while it can speed up economic progress and that can alleviate poverty, it can also speed up the risk of certain technologies, right? And just like force people to keep developing because they're in competition with one another. And it's hard to like slow down and say, hey, China, maybe we should like have a deal about this, like about AI progress or about biological weapon development or something like this, right? And so from that point of view, it could look a little scary. And I think the basic answer is right now, like I don't know. What the answer is.
So that's fair. So I guess earlier when I said that like I'm getting concerned with the fact that one could basically justify anything this way. I realize I'm kind of repeating myself in the sense that this is the same point I made about the Gulag and utopian thinking, to which your answer was, well, man, like we got to be reasonable and we have to think through these consequences carefully. And so all of this has to be said with the understanding that it also requires a lot of like careful, thoughtful considerations on a case-by-case basis. And so any kind of concern I have, I think, is alleviated with the understanding that this isn't just one calculus that we can rely on forever, but it always is going to require careful consideration of the particulars in a particular situation. So I just wanted to say that I'm not as concerned as I was earlier, because you essentially already addressed that point half an hour ago. So that's a fair
anyway,
point.
So it's not to say that this makes decision making easy, far from it. It makes it like very hard, right? Because like everything's so uncertain all of a sudden, but that doesn't mean it's a reason for not doing it, right? Like I would argue consequentialism does the same thing all of a sudden. This is exactly what you were arguing last time. Like now you have to like really think about your decisions all the time, about how their consequences, and now you're in a continuous ongoing conversation. And this is like a burden to some extent, right? But it's also just like seems like the most reasonable thing to do. Given our knowledge.
That's totally fair, man. You've convinced me that this is very much just an aspect of consequentialism, which is don't forget the future generations. I'm really interested though. So something you had said about the Nobel Prize winner knocking down the discount rate made me want to ask a related question, which is how often do these kind of moral considerations impact the decisions you make every day as an economist, or working with economists if you don't self-identify as an economist? Like, are these the kind of things that like you need to have your philosophy in check because someone's going to come to you with a particular model, somebody else is going to come to you with a different variant of the model, and whether you think one way or another way is going to influence kind of which of these models you want to work on in these kind of questions, or is the Nobel Prize example kind of a one-off salient example?
No, I think it's relatively common in economics research. I think my research is more like data science applied to like government organizations and trying to like improve the decision-making processes of government institutions. And so there's less like model choosing there, and it's more just like allowing them to make better decisions with data. So there's less like decision points to be like analyzed there. But I think in economics, you have to decide like which model is going to go into your paper, and you have to like lend different amount of credences to different models based on the results they're telling you, right? And this is like, on one hand, a huge problem because people's like biases now enter into it, and like, you know, the result you want to get out is the result you want to get out, and so this is going to inform like which model you choose. But I think the biggest impact for me has just been thinking about like my career, basically, like how, you know, how do you choose a career that looks relatively good by long-termist lights, like via this ethical framework. And so that's been like that's like a hard choice, and like has taken many of my waking hours trying to think through.
Yeah, well, I remember you had told me online once that the reason you switched out of kind of like theoretical mathematics into economics is you were considering, I forgot the way you phrased it, but basically that you could have made a much bigger impact in economics, and I think you used a better term for that. But I wonder if you could say just a bit more about that, because that's really fascinating that you chose the career that you're currently pursuing precisely because of this kind of thinking. And so it's just a beautiful example of how philosophy matters. And so if you could say more about that, I would be really enjoy hearing it.
Yeah. One plug I should make here for anyone who's actually listening is like my decision on this front is like very influenced by the thinking that sort of drives the organization called 80,000 Hours, which is an organization sort of dedicated to helping people find the career that they're gonna have that's gonna make the biggest impact, given their interests and strengths and things like this. So anyway, just like shout out to that. But I mean, basically, it was a relatively simple decision-making process. I think it was like one of looking at the field of sort of theoretical computer science and math, and looking at one, how much impact like the sort of the average academic has in that field on the outside world, not necessarily on that field, and then two, how I think my skills sort of compared with like the average like mathematician or theoretical computer scientist. And I think basically my thought was like, well, it seems like to push those fields forward, you basically have to be at the tail end of the distribution of these mathematicians and computer scientists. It's sort of like this in all scientific disciplines, right? There's like a few people who like really push a field forward, and then most people sort of just like follow up, like filling in the gaps and things like this. And so in order to like have a huge impact, you kind of have to be like one of these figureheads, and I just was like, had to be honest that my skills were not at that level, right? These are like the Terry Taos of the world and things like this, and I was just like not even close to this level. And that's not to say that people who aren't making like the biggest leaps and bounds are not valuable. It's like not the sense at all. It's just like, what sort of value do you want your career to have? And I think to like work in theory and work on problems that like no one else is thinking about at the moment takes like a certain amount of bravery that I just don't think I have, right? I'm like a little more risk averse with my career and my impact, I think. So I think theory is still like is still valuable. Like we need it. And especially because it's very unclear where the next breakthrough or where the next applicable breakthrough is going to come from, right? Like we developed number theory long before cryptography, and it was very unclear that was going to have such massive ramifications. And so it's hard to look for the type of theory that's going to inform application, or practical knowledge, like before we get there, right? So it's important to have people on those boundaries. But for me, I was just like, it's a much surer bet to have a bigger impact if I switch into something more applied. And so that's what prompted the switch, basically.
That's cool. So to summarize it, it's like, in order to have impact in this particular field, you'd have to essentially be at like Terry Tao's level, which is madness. Yeah. But you were able to then have a big impact in economics, given your particular skill set and the desire and the need for that skill set in a different field.
Or at least really hoping to. I think it's like it's just like a bigger bet that I can have more of an impact.
Well, it's so cool, man, because like my career trajectory, I've not once thought about impact. I tend to think purely in terms of like my own gratification and pleasure. In all seriousness, it's just, what do I find to be the most fun at this particular moment, and then I do that. And so it's just really cool to see that your consideration and concern for the lives of people in the future is something which you're actually acting on, which you're actually making career decisions based on, compared to me, which is I like thinking about philosophy and epistemology purely because I think it's fun to think about, but I don't think I walk the walk in the same sense that you do, and so just want to kind of give you props.
Yeah,
for
I
that.
mean, thanks. I think I don't think it's as warranted maybe as you think. Like, I think so. I'm a big fan of the book The Elephant in the Brain, which is all about like the hidden motives behind our actions and how our motives can be hidden. Yeah, exactly. So Robin Hanson and Kevin Simler wrote this book, and it's all about like how our motives can even be hidden from ourselves, from our conscious selves, right? And so it's like a constant struggle to figure out like what part of my interest is due to just like my ego. For example, this is like a huge struggle when I'm thinking about like, should I do a PhD? Should I do a JD? Like, all this stuff. I'm like, what part of this is just like me wanting to have this thing, this degree so that I like look badass, And like what part of it is like me actually thinking this is like a valuable track. And like, I think a lot of it comes down to my ego anyway, right? And you could argue like the career switch is just so I can be like more visible, right? Someone's going to be way more visible like working in economics than they are in fucking theoretical computer science. So it's like, it's like very unclear that it's actually not just my ego taking over anyway. So that's like a constant battle. But like,
we've been talking for a bit, so we should consider winding down soon. But I so I haven't read Hanson's book. I've listened to him speak a number of times and read kind of his discussions with. Did he talk to Scott Alexander, Slate Star Codex, or did Scott Alexander just write a review of the book? There's some crossover.
Yeah, okay.
Doesn't matter. So anyway, I haven't read the book is the main reason I want to say that. But in some sense, like I completely agree with the thesis, which is that our hidden motivations are not at all our stated motivations for most of our actions. And that's perfectly in agreement with like the we don't have free will topic. And so I agree, but I keep returning to this idea of like, so what? Like, if what you're doing now is really just because of your desire for ego gratification,
right,
it doesn't really matter to me because you're still making an impact and you're still doing cool shit and helping people. And so this like one must do good for its own sake thing, which I don't know how much of this is implicit in Hanson's book or not, but but like. If I just take it as an assumption that everybody does stuff for reasons that are unbeknownst to them,
right,
I'm kind of left in the same place as I was before taking on that assumption, which is that people do things, and sometimes the things people do makes the world better.
Totally.
And so, I guess even if it's purely for your own ego fulfillment, I still think props to you. But likely it's not because it's more just about the impact that you have.
Yeah, no, I think I agree. I mean, it's much more of an explanation than a prescription, right? It's not saying like you should act differently because of this. It's just sort of like you should beware of your actions. And I think once you read the book, it's like it can become almost quite obvious to you. That's why it's called The Elephant in the Brain. It's like once you're looking for it, you're sort of aware like how much of your motivation is coming from something that's like not your stated motivation, which is fascinating. And also I just think that, I mean, this also ties into the whole free will thing. Like this is just very consequential when it comes to like praise and blame, right? I just think like most of the time we're like we're not worthy of the praise we're getting, and we're not worthy of the blame we're getting either, right? So I think for sure, it's like we all much closer to the middle of the distribution than we sort of think when it comes to tons of that stuff. But okay, anyway, so I think like one nice way we got like sidetracked a little bit like career stuff there, which is interesting, but maybe like one leading question that I'd like to just hear your thoughts on before we go, and then maybe can lead into stuff last time, is related to like the gulag concerns and stuff you had, which is communism itself was a radical proposal, right? So it like took the system as is, and it sought a utopian solution to current problems, and it sought to just implement those solutions and wasn't looking at any of the consequences along the way. So there was no course correction on the way to the goal. And so my question to you is there ever a situation in which this is warranted? So in which radical change is better than what we might call like incremental change, where you like increment a solution on a small scale, gather feedback, look at data, and then move on to the next stage if things look promising, da-da-da. So is there ever a case where we want these sort of radical proposals to be implemented and we want visionaries to just carry out?
Yes. So I think that historically one could take examples like the French Revolution or the American independence or the Civil War as all being radical changes to the status quo. And radical changes which just take the American Civil War, for example. Slavery was not going to go away itself, and so it was a radical change that was absolutely necessary to get rid of the scourge of slavery. So the answer is yes, but the other part of the question is that, like, I think it requires really dire straits to overthrow systems when there is the option of incrementally improving systems. I tend to gravitate towards those, but I'm not as naive as to say that one should never have radical reform, because obviously history is replete with examples in both cases. But I guess just to say one more thing about the Gulag example, I was actually less thinking in terms of the radical change aspect of it, and more thinking about the internal psychology of those who believe in utopia and what they're willing and capable of doing, which is to say that I imagine that the percentage of guards at Auschwitz who enjoyed it and just would have loved committing these crimes is quite small, and it's more likely to be populated by people who were like, this is fucking hard work, and I wish I wasn't here, but it's so worth it for the great change which will come in the future, and it's so worth it because of the pure Aryan German race which we will be creating, and all of the future happiness which will be brought about given the kind of the hard work and the stuff that I'm doing now. And so my concern with kind of the inclusion of a functionally such a large number of people in the future that you could just approximate it with infinity is that I think it has a psychological effect on some people sometimes, and that psychological effect can be very dangerous. But you also said that, dude, like, obviously this requires careful consideration and all that. So if I condition on the idea that the people who think this way are reasonable and just want to carefully think through the consequences, then I'm not worried. But the widespread adoption of utopian belief systems, I think, is something very much to be worried about. And part of the reason that they have this effect on people is because it includes the future pleasure, and that allows them to kind of discount the current suffering which they're currently doing. So I guess I wanted to answer your question directly first, but then also kind of explain why I brought the Gulag example up a little bit. So
no, that's good. I don't know. I'm looking for insight onto this question of like radical reform versus incremental change. I'm like running up more and more against it these days. Maybe it's just like where I live, it's like a very liberal bubble, so I think people are like very unsatisfied with the status quo and Donald Trump and things, and there's like people proposing radical change left, right, and center. I have a friend who's like very interested in the prison abolition movement and just like we need to abolish all prisons and stuff, and I'm like, holy shit, that seems pretty radical. Like part of me's like all for it, part of me's like how do you know a priori? Like, so Civil War, great. Like obviously in retrospect, abolishing slavery, like we need to go at that hard. Like fuck the system, right? Like tear that thing down. But like how do you know a priori like this is a good idea, right? Like it seems like super hard, right?
This seems like the perfect subject for next week's conversation, frankly. I love it. I think the question of radical reform versus gradual change is super important these days, in particular when you have various factions of the left, like the Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden, completely represent this distinction, right? The Bernie coalition wants to do the radical change, and the Biden coalition wants to representing the institution represents kind of this gradual progress. And so, do you want to pick that up next time.
We can,
I think
sure.
that sounds like a really fruitful place to start our next conversation.
Yeah, that'd be fun. Yeah, cool.
All right, man. Fun round two. Glad we cleared up
that was
some
good,
confusion and got to the politics.
Nice.
Sweet. Cool. Talk to you soon.
All right, take care.